The sun-drenched village of Macumba lay nestled between the gentle curves of the rolling hills, where the rhythmic hum of life echoed through its narrow streets. Here, the houses were built from sun-baked clay, and the air always carried the scent of earth and fresh rain. The villagers, bound by generations of shared history, lived in a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other's name and story. The harmony between the villagers was like the steady beat of a drum, familiar and comforting. However, within this idyllic setting, there were whispers of a brewing storm, hidden behind the smiles of the people who walked its paths. Among the many families in the village, there was one that stood out, the family of the stepmother, a woman known both for her beauty and sharp intellect. A widow who had remarried a kind-hearted but poor man, she quickly understood the value of using her wit and ambition to secure a better future. She had not been content to settle for a modest life. Though she had little wealth, her desires stretched far beyond the confines of her humble home. She saw her daughter not as a child to be cherished, but as a pawn in her own quest for power. Every move she made, every word she spoke, was aimed at achieving her ultimate goal, elevating her family's status in the eyes of the village. Her daughter, Amina, was a striking contrast. With her long dark hair and gentle, caring heart, Amina was loved by all who knew her. She had inherited her father's soft nature and was seen by the villagers as the embodiment of kindness. To Amina, life was about love, happiness, and connection, not power or wealth. While she respected her stepmother, she was often confused by her stern demands, the constant push to be involved in social events, her refusal to let Amina lead a life of her own choosing, and the pressure to marry a man she had never met left her feeling like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. Little did Amina know that her stepmother had already set her sights on a wealthy suitor, determined to marry her off to him as soon as possible, despite Amina's wishes. This suitor was none other than the rich merchant's son, a man of great wealth and influence in the village. His family's fortune had been built over generations, and his name carried weight among the villagers. For the stepmother, this was the ultimate opportunity. Marrying her daughter to the merchant's son would solidify her place in the village's elite circles. She could already taste the luxury and respect that would come with the match. What she did not account for, however, was her daughter's heart. Amina had already fallen in love with someone else, a poor man who had worked alongside the villagers for as long as she could remember. This poor man, Juma, had a heart full of warmth and a spirit untainted by greed. He was a hard-working, humble man who lived simply but had a deep love for Amina. Their friendship, forged in years of shared moments and quiet conversations, had slowly blossomed into love. Amina's heart, however, was torn. She wanted to be with Juma, but the weight of her stepmother's expectations pressed down on her like a heavy stone. The pressure to marry the wealthy suitor grew every day, and Amina's reluctance to obey her stepmother only deepened. As the days passed, the stepmother began to ramp up her efforts, setting up social events, hosting dinners, and arranging meetings with the merchant's son. Amina's heart grew heavier with each passing day. She found herself slipping away from the watchful eyes of her stepmother to secretly meet Juma, finding solace in his presence. These secret meetings were moments of freedom, of genuine connection, where she could be herself. With every stolen kiss and shared laugh, Amina felt the bonds of her stepmother's expectations start to crack. Yet, she was still trapped in a web of societal pressure, unable to defy her stepmother without risking the shame of the community. In the midst of all this, love began to blossom quietly, against the backdrop of her stepmother's scheming. What neither Amina nor her stepmother could have predicted was how this love would come to challenge everything that the stepmother had planned. The stepmother had always prided herself on her ability to manipulate situations to her advantage. Her life had not been an easy one. A once beautiful woman from a small town, she had married a man much older than her, only to be left a widow when he passed away suddenly, leaving her with no fortune, no status, and a young daughter to care for. She had quickly learned the hard way that beauty and kindness alone would not ensure a comfortable life. The world was cruel to women like her, women without wealth, connections, or power. She had to become ruthless, calculative, and sharp, and, when she remarried, she did so not out of love, but out of necessity. Her second husband, though a kind man, was poor and barely able to support her and her daughter. The comfort and luxury she craved seemed forever out of reach. She quickly realized that if she was ever to elevate herself in the eyes of the villagers, she needed more than just a good man. She needed status, and status came through wealth and connections. That's when her plans for her daughter began to take shape. To the stepmother, Amina was not simply a daughter to love and care for. No, Amina was her ticket to a better life. The poor girl with a gentle heart had no idea that her mother's affection was often laced with hidden motives. The stepmother knew that the wealth of the merchant's family could provide her the life she dreamed of, and Amina, with her beauty and kindness, was the perfect tool to make it happen. As the plan took form, the stepmother began to manipulate her daughter in subtle ways. She would speak of how lucky she was to have been offered the hand of such a wealthy man. She would insist that Amina's feelings were secondary to the family's needs, making her feel guilty for not wanting to marry a man who could secure their future. "Think of your father's struggles," she would say, her voice filled with feigned sympathy. "Think of the life we could have, the house, the respect in the village. You owe it to us, to him, to give us this chance." Amina's resistance was slowly crushed under the weight of these emotional pleas. The stepmother made her feel like an ungrateful daughter, making her doubt her own desires. It was for the family's good, after all. Her happiness would be achieved through this marriage, whether she wanted it or not. But Amina, despite the constant pressure, could not ignore the pull of her own heart. She had always found comfort in the quiet moments she shared with Juma, the poor man who worked in the village as a carpenter. Juma was kind and honest, and his humble life had always been a source of peace for Amina, in stark contrast to her stepmother's demanding, manipulative ways. With every glance, every word, and every quiet moment spent with him, Amina felt her love for him grow stronger. Their love blossomed secretly. They would meet in the marketplace when the crowds were thick enough to shield them from prying eyes, or they would wander the outskirts of the village where the green fields stretched out like a quiet sanctuary. These moments were fleeting, but for Amina, they were everything. With Juma, she didn't feel like a puppet in a game of manipulation. She felt free, loved, and most importantly, seen. But as she spent more time with Juma, doubts began to creep into her mind. Was her stepmother really looking out for her well-being, or was it all part of a bigger plan to secure her own future? Amina found herself questioning everything. She had always trusted her stepmother, believing that her intentions were good, that she wanted nothing but happiness for her daughter. But now, the truth seemed far more complicated. Was it truly love she had been shown, or simply a means to an end? One evening, as the stepmother relentlessly discussed the upcoming wedding with Amina, making arrangements with the merchant's family and pushing her further into the marriage, Amina's frustration boiled over. She had had enough. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I don't want to marry him," she said quietly, but firmly, staring at the floor. The stepmother's eyes widened in shock and anger, but Amina didn't flinch. "I don't want to be part of your plan. I want to choose my own path." For a moment, the stepmother was silent. Her face hardened into a mask of cold calculation, and she stepped closer to her daughter. "Amina, you have no idea what you're talking about. This marriage is the best thing that will ever happen to you. It's not just about you. It's about us, about our future. You're being selfish." Amina's chest tightened as she struggled to hold back the tears. Selfish. The word cut deeper than she had anticipated. She had always feared disappointing her stepmother, But now, for the first time, she felt a strange sense of rebellion stirring within her. What about my future, mother? What about my happiness? Don't I deserve that? Amina's voice wavered, but there was a new strength in it. The seeds of resistance had been planted. The stepmother took a deep breath, her fingers clenched tightly. You will do what's best for you, for this family. You will marry him, and you will be grateful. Amina didn't respond. Instead, she fled from the room, her heart racing. As she walked through the quiet streets of the village, she felt a surge of determination. She could not go through with this marriage, not if it meant sacrificing the life she dreamed of, the life she shared with Juma. That night, as the wind howled outside, Amina lay awake in her bed, the weight of her decision heavy on her chest. A part of her still feared the wrath of her stepmother, but another part, the part that had begun to question everything, felt an unspoken promise of freedom. She knew that this was just the beginning of a battle she would have to fight, not only for her love, but for her own identity, for her own future. Amina's rebellion had begun. The stepmother's plan had progressed as she envisioned. Each step, each word, each action was calculated, designed to push Amina further into the arms of the wealthy merchant's son. Amina, despite her quiet resistance, found herself swept up in the tide of her stepmother's manipulations. Engagement letters had been sent, and the preparations for the wedding were well underway. It was as if the entire village knew of the impending union, and yet Amina felt more alone than ever before. The stepmother had already made arrangements for an extravagant ceremony, one that would leave no room for doubt about the new status Amina's family would gain. Everything was meticulously planned. The dresses, the food, the guest list, the lavish decorations. It was meant to be a celebration, but to Amina, it felt more like a prison sentence. Every detail of the wedding was a reminder of the life she had no desire to lead. As the days went by, the pressure grew. Amina's stepmother insisted that Amina practice her social graces, pushing her to perfect her smile, her posture, her way of speaking. Every encounter with the merchant's son was carefully orchestrated to show the perfect image of a future wife. The stepmother had even begun to monitor her daughter's movements, ensuring that she was never alone for too long and always within reach of her plans. Amina's freedom shrank until she barely recognized herself. The daughter's internal turmoil was growing harder to ignore. Every time she was alone in her room, the weight of her mother's expectations felt unbearable. She wanted to scream, to run away from it all. But the suffocating grip of her stepmother's control was too strong. She had tried to resist once, but the stepmother's tactics had been so powerful, so emotionally manipulative, that Amina found herself retreating back into silence. One day, as Amina wandered through the village, seeking a brief escape from the looming wedding preparations, she met with her closest friend, Zuri, a wise and trusted elder who had watched Amina grow up. Zuri had always been a source of comfort and guidance for Amina, offering a safe space to speak her heart. When Amina confided in Zuri about the engagement, her words came out in a rush, as though they had been building up inside her for weeks. "I feel like I'm drowning, Zuri," Amina confessed, her voice trembling with emotion. "Everywhere I turn, it's the wedding. It's him. It's what my mother wants. I have no voice in this, no choice." Zuri listened intently, her gaze soft but firm. "Your mother may have control of the situation now, Amina, but you still have the power to choose your own future. You must not let her manipulate your heart. You must listen to your own voice." The older woman's words gave Amina a momentary sense of peace, but her heart still ached. Aching not only for the love she felt for Juma, the poor man who had captured her heart, but also for the quiet rebellion stirring within her. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, Amina met Juma in their usual secret place near the riverbank. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting a silvery glow over the land. They had been meeting here for weeks, sharing moments of tenderness and unspoken words, their love blossoming in secrecy. Juma's eyes were full of warmth, his smile reassuring, but today there was something different in his gaze, something urgent. "Amina," he said, his voice low, "I can't stand seeing you like this, caught in your mother's web. I know you're torn, but we can escape. We can leave this village and start a new life far from here, where no one knows us, where no one can control you. We can be together. We can be free." Amina's heart leapt at his words, at the thought of a life outside the reach of her mother's influence. The idea of running away, starting anew, was tantalizing, but there was also the gnawing fear of consequences. She looked down at her hands, trembling slightly. "Juma, I want to be with you, more than anything, but my family—" Her voice broke, and she shook her head, unable to express the depth of her internal conflict. Juma reached out and gently cupped her face, lifting her chin so that their eyes met. "Amina, no matter what your family says or does, you have the right to choose your own life. You don't owe anyone your happiness but yourself." For a brief moment, Amina felt a rush of freedom, a brief glimmer of hope. But as quickly as it appeared, doubt crept in again. The wedding was only days away, and she was so deeply entrenched in her stepmother's world that the thought of leaving everything behind was almost impossible to grasp. I don't know if I'm strong enough," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Juma squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with both sadness and understanding. "I'll wait for you, Amina. I'll wait as long as it takes. But don't let fear decide your fate." Amina nodded, though the doubts still lingered. She wished more than anything that she could simply walk away and leave her old life behind. But the chains of her family obligations, her stepmother's control, and the weight of the engagement were too heavy to shed in a single moment. Back at home, her stepmother's control grew increasingly suffocating. The wedding preparations intensified. Amina's stepmother made sure every detail was perfect, even down to the smallest of gestures. Every smile, every word she spoke was designed to showcase Amina as the perfect bride for the wealthy suitor. No longer allowed to visit her friends, Amina found herself isolated from the very people who had been her source of support and comfort. It was clear to Amina that her stepmother's manipulations had no boundaries. One evening, when Amina expressed her exhaustion, both physically and emotionally, the stepmother's response was chilling. "You will not fail me, Amina," she said with a hard edge to her voice. "If you dare to go against this marriage, if you choose that boy over your future, I will make sure you regret it. You have no choice but to marry him. If you think I will let you ruin everything I've worked for, you're wrong." The threat was veiled, but it was unmistakable. The stepmother's words sent a cold shiver down Amina's spine. She realized with sickening clarity just how far her stepmother would go to ensure her own desires were fulfilled. Her world felt like it was closing in. The pressure to comply was unbearable, but the thought of losing Juma, of a future without his love, was even worse. Amina's rebellion had been a whisper in her heart, but now, as the tension between her family's expectations and her own desires reached a breaking point, the time for silence was over. She had to choose, and soon. The poor man, Juma, had seen enough. He could no longer stand by and watch as Amina's life was ripped apart by her stepmother's manipulations. He had tried to be patient, to bide his time, hoping that she would find a way to free herself, but the situation had reached a breaking point. The woman he loved was trapped in a gilded cage, suffocating under the weight of her family's expectations and her stepmother's ruthless ambition. It was late one evening when Juma, filled with determination, made his way to the stepmother's house. He had heard the rumors circulating in the village about the engagement, how the stepmother had practically sold her daughter to the highest bidder. Juma's heart burned with anger and frustration, but what hurt most was that he had to stand by, helpless, while Amina was forced into a life that was not hers. That all changed tonight. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light over the dirt road as Juma knocked on the door of the house that had once felt like a place of refuge to him. He had visited before, But tonight was different. Tonight, he was no longer the humble, poor man from the village. Tonight, he would confront the stepmother head-on, defy the social class divide, and ask for Amina's hand in marriage. When the stepmother answered the door, her eyes narrowed as she recognized him. Juma had always been the quiet one, the man with few words, but tonight, there was a fire in his eyes that demanded attention. "What do you want, Juma?" The stepmother's voice was dripping with disdain, though she had learned to hide her surprise at his sudden visit. "I've come to speak with you about Amina," Juma said firmly, standing tall in the doorway. "I will not allow her to be forced into a marriage she doesn't want. I know you have plans, but I am asking for her hand in marriage, not for wealth or status, but for love." The stepmother's face twisted in disbelief, a laugh escaping her lips. "Love? You think you can offer her love? Look at you. What do you have to give? You're poor, Juma. You can't offer her anything. Do you think she'll throw away her future for a simple man like you?" Juma's gaze didn't falter. He stepped forward, his voice steady but fierce. "I may not have wealth, but I have something far more valuable. My heart, my devotion, and my willingness to fight for her happiness. I will work for her. I will care for her, and I will protect her. That is more than you will ever give her." The stepmother sneered, her face darkening with anger. "You have no right to come here and demand anything. She is my daughter, and I will decide her future. You think you can just waltz in and take her from me? You have no place in this family." But Juma stood firm, refusing to back down. "I know the risks, I know the consequences, but I will fight for her. I won't let you take her life away from her, not without a fight." The stepmother's eyes flashed with fury, but Juma's resolve was unwavering. This was no longer about status or wealth. It was about Amina's freedom, her right to choose her own path, to marry for love, not power. When Juma left the stepmother's house that night, he didn't have the victory he had hoped for, but something more important. He had made his stand. He had declared to both the stepmother and the village that he would not let Amina's future be decided by anyone but her. But now, his work was far from over. His fight was just beginning. Meanwhile, Amina, back in her room, wrestled with her emotions. The weight of her mother's expectations was crushing her, but Juma's words echoed in her mind. "I will fight for her happiness." For the first time in weeks, Amina felt a spark of hope ignite within her heart. She had been living in the shadows of other people's dreams for so long, her future decided by her mother, her stepmother, and society's rigid rules. But Juma had defied it all, challenging the very foundation of her family's plans, and it had made her see things differently. Amina knew what her mother would say if she learned of Juma's visit. The stepmother would surely increase the pressure, tighten her grip, and force Amina to marry the wealthy suitor. But as Amina sat in her room, she realized that she had been living in fear for too long. Fear of disobeying her mother, fear of ruining the family's reputation, fear of making the wrong choice. But Juma's love had shown her a different path, a path of freedom, a path where she could choose her own happiness, even if it meant risking everything. The conflict within Amina raged on. She loved Juma, but could she truly leave everything behind? Could she betray her family, abandon her stepmother's plans, and defy everything she had been taught to believe? It was a choice she had never wanted to make, but now there was no escaping it. Her heart longed for Juma, for a life of love, but her duty to her family, her loyalty to her mother's wishes, held her back. The tension between love and duty, between desire and obligation, was tearing her apart. But as the days passed, the pressure from her stepmother only grew. Amina could feel the walls closing in around her. She began to realize that, in order to have the life she dreamed of, she would need to act. She needed to make a decision, and soon. One quiet evening, as she sat alone in the garden, Amina made up her mind. She would meet with Juma, and together they would make a plan to escape. It would be risky, it would be dangerous, but it was the only way she could see to live the life she truly wanted. The next day, they met in secret by the riverbank, where the moonlight kissed the surface of the water. Here, under the cover of night, they made a pact to leave everything behind and escape to a place where their love could flourish without fear. "I don't know what will happen, Amina," Juma said, his voice filled with both determination and worry. "But I promise you this, I will never stop fighting for you, no matter the cost." Amina nodded, her heart heavy but filled with a sense of freedom. "I love you, Juma, and I'm willing to fight for us too." Together, they made their pact, knowing full well the dangers they faced. They would have to be quick, careful, and courageous. The stepmother would not let them go easily, but neither would they let her hold them back. Their future, their love, was worth the risk. As the days drew closer to the wedding, the atmosphere in the household grew increasingly tense. The stepmother had meticulously planned every detail of the event, from the lavish feast to the guest list. She had ensured that every aspect of the wedding would showcase her family's newfound prestige and solidify their position as part of the village elite. For her, the wedding was not just a marriage between two people. It was a social maneuver, a way to climb higher on the social ladder. Nothing, not even her daughter's happiness, would stand in the way of her ambitions. Amina, on the other hand, was drowning in despair. The relentless pressure from her stepmother felt like a vice around her chest, and every day brought with it the unbearable weight of expectations. The grand wedding preparations, the dresses, the guests, the speeches, were all meticulously planned to perfection, each detail designed to remind Amina of her role in her mother's scheme. But as the days ticked down, Amina felt herself slipping away from the world her mother was creating for her. She no longer recognized the young woman she had once been. The girl who had dreamed of a life filled with love, not ambition. The girl who had once believed in destiny, in a life shaped by her own choices. In her heart, Amina had known all along that the marriage to the wealthy man was not her choice. She had never wanted it. She wanted Juma. She wanted a future with him, a future built on love, not wealth. But every time she tried to voice her feelings, her mother's anger grew more intense. The stepmother's words were cutting, and her threats were becoming more frequent and more harsh. Amina had been manipulated into a corner where her choices seemed limited, where her happiness appeared to come at the expense of everything she had ever known. As the wedding day drew closer, Amina's resistance deepened. Every night she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, contemplating the life her mother had planned for her. She could feel Juma's presence in her heart, his quiet strength giving her courage. But even so, her mother's will was suffocating, and Amina feared the consequences of defying her. What would happen to her family? To the life they had built in the village? It was on the eve of the wedding that Amina decided she could no longer remain silent. She could no longer let herself be bound by the chains of her mother's ambition. She had reached the breaking point, and it was time for her to take control of her own destiny. With her heart pounding in her chest, Amina dressed herself in a simple gown, one that was far less extravagant than the one her mother had selected for her wedding. She stood before the mirror, staring at her reflection. For the first time in a long while, she saw herself, not as the obedient daughter her mother wanted her to be, but as a woman who had a voice, a woman who could make her own choices. The plan was risky, but Amina had no choice but to act. She had already spoken to Juma, and together they had agreed on an escape route. The night before the wedding, they would meet at the edge of the village, by the riverbank where they had first declared their love for one another. It would be their one chance to flee before the wedding ceremony began. The escape was dangerous. There would be no going back, no second chances. But Amina knew in her heart that she could never go through with the wedding. She would not betray her heart, not for anyone. With quiet resolve, Amina left her room and walked down the narrow hall, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. Her mother was busy preparing final details for the wedding, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Amina moved swiftly and silently, her mind set on the only path that would lead her to freedom. When she reached the door, she opened it slowly, making sure it didn't creak. She stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of her decision heavy on her chest. But as she made her way toward the edge of the village, her heart raced in her chest, and a feeling of dread began to creep in. She could hear the faint sound of voices in the distance, the wedding guests arriving, the stepmother barking orders at the servants. The entire village was preparing for what was supposed to be the happiest day of Amina's life. But to her, it felt like a death sentence. Just as she reached the edge of the village, Amina caught sight of Juma waiting for her by the river. His figure stood tall and unwavering under the moonlight, his love for her shining in his eyes. As soon as he saw her, he rushed forward, taking her hands in his. "I knew you would come," he said, his voice filled with relief. "I had no choice," Amina whispered. "But I'm scared, Juma. What if we fail? What if they catch us?" Juma cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had welled in her eyes. "No one can stop us now. We're free to choose our own path, Amina, and I'll be by your side every step of the way." As they exchanged a brief but passionate kiss, a sudden voice shattered the moment. "Amina! Juma!" It was her stepmother's voice, filled with fury. The stepmother had found them. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, stepping out from the shadows, her eyes flashing with rage. "You're throwing everything away for this?" She turned to Juma with a sneer. "And you? What do you think you can offer her? You're nothing!" But Amina stood tall, her heart steady, her resolve unshakable. "I'm not your pawn, mother. I'm not a piece in your game. I'm choosing my own future, and Juma is part of it." The stepmother's face contorted with anger, but there was also a flicker of fear in her eyes. She realized that her grip on Amina was slipping. The control she had so carefully built was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In that moment, the village began to stir. Whispers spread like wildfire, and the villagers who had been loyal to the stepmother started to question her authority. The sight of Amina defying her, mother's will, was a spark that ignited something within the community. Some villagers, who had once been in awe of the stepmother's status and power, began to side with the daughter. They saw in Amina's courage a reflection of their own suppressed desires for freedom and happiness. The stepmother's reign was beginning to crack. The village, once her domain, was no longer under her control. Amina's rebellion had set something in motion, something that could not be undone. The battle for Amina's happiness had only just begun, and the stepmother was about to learn that no amount of manipulation could hold back the power of true love. As the day of the wedding arrived, a tense stillness hung over the village. The air was thick with expectation, the last-minute preparations for the grand event unfolding at a frantic pace. The stepmother, with her usual cold precision, was overseeing every detail, directing the servants, arranging the flower decorations, making sure every guest had their seat in the grand hall. Everything had to be perfect, just as she had planned. She was so close to achieving her ultimate goal, the union of her daughter with a wealthy suitor, the final step in cementing her position at the top of the village's social hierarchy. Amina, however, felt like a ghost in her own life. Every step she took in the house, every glance she cast upon the finely prepared wedding dress, felt like a part of her soul was being crushed. She had agreed to the secret plan with Juma, but as the hours ticked by, her resolve began to waver. The weight of her mother's manipulation and control was unbearable. This wedding was not her own, and every moment spent in this house was a step farther from the life she truly desired. Juma, ever the steadfast lover, stood by her side in the shadows. He had arrived in the village earlier that morning, preparing for a confrontation that would change everything. The final pieces of their plan had fallen into place, and now it was time for action. He had gathered a few key villagers, people who had grown disillusioned with the stepmother's reign of fear and manipulation. They had agreed to stand by Amina and Juma's side, no longer content to watch the young woman be sacrificed to the whims of a selfish woman who cared only for status. The time had come. Juma, with the support of the villagers, marched to the heart of the village square, where the grand wedding ceremony was to take place. Word had spread quickly, and the townspeople, curious and cautious, began to gather in anticipation. The scene that was about to unfold would decide Amina's fate, and ultimately the stepmother's. The grand hall, the venue of the wedding, was lavishly decorated, the light from the chandeliers glistening off the silverware and fine china. Amina stood at the back, hidden behind the heavy curtains, still in her simple gown, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she couldn't go through with it, but her heart felt torn. She loved Juma, but the world she had known, the life her mother had crafted for her, was slipping away. Could she really leave everything behind? Could she risk it all for a life of uncertainty? The stepmother, radiant in her carefully chosen dress, stood at the front of the hall, overseeing the ceremony preparations. She couldn't understand why Amina had been avoiding her, but today she was sure her daughter would fall in line. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the culmination of years of planning. But then, as the first guests began to take their seats, a loud voice rang out across the village square. "I'm here to take her away," Juma declared, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. The stepmother froze, her eyes locking onto him. The gathered crowd fell into a stunned silence, unsure of how to react. Amina stepped forward, her hand trembling as she grasped Juma's. "This is the man I choose," Amina said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not him," she gestured toward the wealthy suitor, who stood with a look of confusion and shock on his face. "I choose Juma. I will not be a pawn in your game, mother. I will not live my life for your gain." The stepmother's face flushed with fury. Her perfect plan was crumbling before her eyes. She had spent years grooming Amina for this moment, and now it was slipping through her fingers. Her voice came out low and venomous, her anger barely contained. "How dare you! You are nothing but a servant's child," she hissed at Juma. "You think you can take my daughter away from me? You think you can ruin everything I've worked for?" Juma didn't flinch. With his eyes locked onto the stepmother's, he took a bold step forward. "You may have controlled Amina's life until now, but you can't control her heart," he said, his voice unwavering. "You can't control the love we share. We are leaving, and you can't stop us." The stepmother's face twisted in rage. For the first time, her composure cracked, her carefully crafted mask of control breaking apart. She stepped toward Amina, her hands trembling with fury. But the daughter stood her ground, her hand still firmly in Juma's. "You will regret this," the stepmother spat, her voice trembling with rage. "I will make sure you regret this decision. You have no future without me, Amina. You will never survive without the protection I've given you." The villagers, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, began to murmur among themselves. What had once been an unquestioned alliance with the stepmother was beginning to unravel. One by one, villagers who had been loyal to her began to step forward, voicing their support for Amina and Juma. Their whispers grew louder, the tide turning in favor of the young lovers. The stepmother, used to being revered and feared, now found herself surrounded by people who were no longer afraid of her. The stepmother's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She rushed toward the exit, her heels clicking against the floor, but the villagers blocked her path, their eyes cold with defiance. For the first time, she was powerless. "Enough, Amina," she hissed, her voice cracking with desperation. "You'll regret this." Amina stood tall, her back straight, her hand in Juma's, surrounded by the villagers who now rallied behind them. She felt free, for the first time in years. Her mother's control had finally crumbled, and in that moment, she realized that true freedom was worth any price. True love not power, was the greatest force in the world. The stepmother, now isolated and humiliated, had no choice but to leave. Her grand plans lay in ruins, and her once unchallenged authority over the village was shattered. As she disappeared into the distance, the villagers erupted into cheers, celebrating the victory of love over manipulation, of freedom over fear. Juma and Amina stood hand in hand, their future uncertain but their hearts full of hope. They had defied the odds, faced down the forces of control, and chosen a life of love over riches. And as the sun set on that fateful day, Amina knew without a doubt that her life would never be the same. The stepmother's plan had crumbled completely, and Amina and Juma, the poor man she had chosen, would build their own future, free from the shackles of her ambition. As the dust settled on that dramatic day of defiance, the village began to piece itself back together, but nothing would ever be the same. The stepmother, once a figure of fear and respect, now found herself ostracized from the very community that had once revered her. Word of her manipulation and cruelty spread through the village like wildfire, and soon, the villagers who had once been fearful of her now regarded her with disdain. The sharp whispers and cold stares followed her wherever she went, and it became increasingly clear that her influence had evaporated. In the days that followed, the stepmother became a shadow of the woman she had once been. Her manipulative schemes and power plays had collapsed, leaving her with nothing but a tarnished reputation. Unable to regain her footing in the village, and with no allies left to turn to, she quietly packed her belongings and left the only home she had ever known. Her departure was met with little fanfare. No one followed her. No one begged her to stay. The village, once so tightly controlled by her, breathed a collective sigh of relief. Amina, now free from the stepmother's clutches, could finally breathe deeply. For the first time in years, she felt unburdened. The love she had always dreamed of was now within her reach, and she was no longer held captive by fear and obligation. She and Juma, the poor man who had fought for her heart, were now free to build a life together. Their union was not born from riches or grand ceremonies, but from the purity of their love and mutual respect. The villagers, who had watched the tumultuous events unfold with varying degrees of curiosity and judgment, found themselves rooting for the young couple. Amina's courage and Juma's unwavering devotion had inspired them. In a quiet, heartfelt ceremony, far removed from the extravagant displays of wealth the stepmother had dreamed of, Amina and Juma were married. The ceremony was simple, but it was filled with warmth, joy, and the genuine affection of those who had supported them along the way. It was a day of celebration, not just of their love, but of the triumph of true values: love, freedom, and independence, over the cold ambitions of power and control. The villagers, once divided in their loyalties, now came together in joy, celebrating the couple's newfound happiness. Amina, standing beside her husband, realized the true depth of her journey. It had not been easy to break free from her mother's grasp, but it had been worth it. The love between her and Juma, though humble in material wealth, was rich in the things that truly mattered. Together, they represented a new beginning, a break from the old ways of power and manipulation. As the newlyweds began their life together, Amina found herself reflecting on all that had led her to this moment. The journey had not been simple. She had fought against her own mother, endured guilt and shame, and faced societal pressures. But through it all, she had learned the importance of self-determination. She had learned that true love was not about social status, wealth, or approval. It was about mutual respect, kindness, and the willingness to sacrifice for each other. For the stepmother, the road to redemption was a long and solitary one. Though she had never expressed regret for her actions, there was a quiet acknowledgement within her as she left the village. Perhaps, in the solitude of her departure, she began to reflect on the choices she had made. Could there be room for redemption in her heart? The answer was unclear, but as she disappeared into the distance, the hope remained that she would one day recognize the error of her ways. For Amina, the future was bright, filled with possibilities. There were still challenges ahead, no doubt, but now she faced them with the strength that came from knowing who she was and what she wanted. She was no longer the passive victim of her stepmother's schemes, but a woman in charge of her own fate. With Juma by her side, they would build a life filled with love and promise, unencumbered by the burdens of the past. The village, too, had learned a valuable lesson. In a world where power, control, and wealth were often prioritized above all else, Amina and Juma's story reminded them of the power of love, of kindness, and of standing up for what was right. The villagers had watched the stepmothers rise and fall, and they had seen the triumph of love and independence over manipulation and greed. As the sun set on the horizon, the village settled into a peaceful, contented silence. The air was filled with the sounds of celebration, of new beginnings, and of love. Amina and Juma, hand in hand, looked to the future with hope, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they had each other, and that was enough. Together, they would build a life of their own, one not defined by wealth, but by the strength of their bond and the purity of their hearts. The stepmother's wicked scheme had crumbled, and in its place, a love story for the ages had emerged, one that would be remembered in the village for generations to come.